Stapes didn't step into a kitchen. She stepped into a slaughterhouse. The smell hit her first, copper and expensive cologne. Then she saw him. He was sprawled against the gunmetal gray cabinets, his white shirt a ruin of crimson, looking like a fallen prince in a high-rise castle. He didn't have a weapon, but the look in his dying eyes was dangerous enough to stop her heart. The story opens in a rain-slicked city where Renna, a veterinary school dropout struggling in the gig economy, arrives at the Obsidian Tower with a heavy delivery bag and aching shoulders. She takes the silent luxury elevator to the penthouse to deliver a pizza, order number 4492, driven by desperation for the tip as she faces eviction for unpaid rent. When the doors open, she finds the apartment dark, silent, and eerie, with no one answering her call. As she steps onto the polished marble, she discovers a blood trail leading to the kitchen cabinets, where she finds Julian Valley, identifiable by his notorious serpent neck tattoo, bleeding out on the floor. Renna's knees hit the marble with a wet thud. She didn't scream. Screams were for people who expected someone to come save them. Instead, her hands moved with a muscle memory that had nothing to do with pizza. She pressed her fingers against the man's neck, right over the ink of the serpent. His pulse was thready, a frantic drumbeat against her fingertips. "Hey," she said, her voice sounding too loud in the cavernous kitchen. "Stay with me." Julian Valley's eyes fluttered, unfocused and glassy. He coughed, a wet, hacking sound that sprayed fine red mist onto his white collar. Renna looked down. The blood was pooling dark and fast around his waist. It was a gut shot. The worst kind. It meant internal bleeding, sepsis, and a slow, agonizing death if the shock didn't kill him first. She scrambled for the smartphone she'd been clutching. Her thumb hovered over the emergency dial. It was the only logical move. "No," he rasped. His hand shot out, gripping her wrist. His fingers were cold, slippery with his own blood, but his grip was surprisingly ironclad. "You need an ambulance," Renna hissed, trying to pull away. "You're bleeding out." "The police." He choked out, the words bubbling up through the fluid in his lungs. He pulled her closer, his gaze suddenly locking onto hers with terrifying clarity. "They were the ones who did this." Renna froze. The silence of the penthouse suddenly felt heavy, suffocating. If the cops put a bullet in the city's biggest crime lord, calling them wouldn't bring a rescue squad. It would bring a cleanup crew. And she was the only witness. She looked at the dying man, then at the service elevator. She could run. She could leave him here to ghost out on the cold floor and disappear back into the rain. But then she looked at her bag. Renna yanked the red thermal backpack forward, unzipping the hidden bottom compartment. It wasn't meant for food. Inside, neatly organized in vacuum-sealed packs, were vials of ketamine, coagulants, antibiotics, and a heavy-duty skin stapler. It was her secret trade, illegal veterinary meds she sold on the side to people who couldn't afford a clinic. "You're lucky I didn't finish school," she muttered, snapping on a pair of latex gloves. She swept the expensive crystal salt shakers off the island with a crash, turning the pristine surface into a triage station. She grabbed a pair of shears and cut open his shirt, exposing the ruin of his abdomen. "This is going to hurt," she told him, cracking a glow stick from her kit to supplement the dim under-cabinet lighting. "Don't you dare die on my shift." Julian's head lolled back against the cabinet, his eyes rolling up until only the whites showed. He was out. It was a mercy, really. The pain of what came next would have broken him. Renna checked his airway one last time, her hands shaking just enough to remind her she was terrified, before standing up. The silence rushed back in, heavy and oppressive. She needed clean linens. Towels, napkins, anything to pack the wound once she got the bleeder clamped. Her eyes darted to the tall, narrow pantry door Julian had been slumped next to. He hadn't just been leaning there for support, she realized. He had been blocking it. Renna stepped over his outstretched legs, her sneakers leaving tacky red prints on the marble. She gripped the brushed steel handle, bracing herself. This was the home of a capo. She expected to find stacks of shrink-wrapped cash, bricks of heroin, or an arsenal of weapons, The kind of things men like Julian Valley died to protect. She yanked the door open, her utility knife raised. It wasn't a stash house. It was a hiding place. Crouched on the floor of the walk-in pantry, wedged between shelves of imported olive oil and pasta, was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 16, wearing expensive silk pajamas that looked ludicrously delicate against the industrial shelving. She was curled into a tight ball, her arms wrapped around her knees, trembling so violently the shelves above her rattled. Renna lowered the knife, the breath knocked out of her. I'm not with them, Renna stammered, her voice dropping to a whisper. The teenager didn't speak. She just stared up at Renna with wide, dark eyes that mirrored the dying man's outside. She was mute with shock, her gaze darting past Renna to the slice of the kitchen visible through the doorway, to the blood. Renna looked back at Julian, motionless on the floor. The narrative in her head shifted violently. He wasn't just a monster guarding his loot. He was a brother who had taken a bullet to the gut to keep a killer away from the store. The cold calculation of survival that had been driving Renna, fix him, survive, get out, evaporated. A different instinct took over, the one that had made her want to be a vet in the first place, the need to protect something that couldn't fight back. Okay, Renna said, her voice hardening with a new resolve. She crouched down, meeting the girl's eyes. Listen to me. My name is Renna. I'm going to save him. But I need you to be brave. Can you be brave for him? The girl gave a tiny, jerky nod. Good, Renna said, standing up and grabbing a stack of linen napkins from a shelf. Stay here. Don't make a sound. She closed the pantry door and turned back to the body on the floor. She wasn't just doing a job anymore. She was saving a family. Renna cracked another glow stick, bathing the wound in a sickly neon green. She didn't have anesthesia strong enough to knock a man his size completely under without risking his heart stopping, so she gave him a heavy dose of ketamine and prayed. Sorry, she whispered. She plunged the long-nosed forceps into the open cavity. The sound was wet and sickening. Renna bit her lip until she tasted copper, her fingers navigating the damage blindly. She felt the jagged edge of a rib, the slick warmth of intestine, and then hard metal. She clamped down and pulled. Julian convulsed. A guttural roar tore from his throat, his eyes snapping open. He didn't look drugged. He looked feral. Don't move, Renna shouted, dropping the bloody bullet into a metal bowl with a heavy clink. Julian's hand scrambled for purchase, gripping the edge of the cabinets until his knuckles turned white. He wasn't looking at the wound. He was looking at her, sweat beading on his pale forehead. You stayed, he managed, his voice a jagged whisper. I found your sister, Renna said, her hands shaking as she reached for the skin stapler. Hold still. I have to close this. Julian slumped back, the fight draining out of him, but his eyes remained locked on her face. His hand drifted up, trembling, to touch the serpent tattoo on his neck. You know why I'm not dead? He asked, the words slurring slightly. Because they missed, Renna said, aligning the heavy industrial stapler over the angry red gash. No, Julian breathed. They don't miss. They needed this. He tapped the ink. It's not just art. It's the key. The accounts, the vault codes, it's all encoded in the design. Renna paused, the stapler hovering inches from his skin. The horror of it clicked into place. They shot me in the gut to slow me down. Julian rasped, a dark, pained smile ghosting his lips. If they kill me outright, the skin degrades. They wanted me alive long enough to cut it off. A chill went through Renna that had nothing to do with the cold penthouse. They weren't just killers, they were butchers. Then let's disappoint them, Renna said. She pressed the stapler down. Kerkhunk. Julian hissed through his teeth, his body arching off the floor. Kerkhunk. She worked quickly, the mechanical sound echoing like gunshots in the quiet kitchen. With every metal staple biting into his flesh, she wasn't just closing a wound. She was sealing a pact. She wasn't the delivery girl anymore. She was the only thing standing between this man and a flaying knife. The soft, musical chime of the main elevator shattered the silence. It was followed immediately by the heavy thud click of the maglocks disengaging on the front door. Renna didn't hesitate. She killed the under-cabinet lights, plunging the kitchen into shadow. Up, she hissed, grabbing Julian's arm and hauling him upward. He groaned, a sound of pure agony, but he found his feet, swaying like a drunkard. Renna lunged for the pantry, yanking the terrified girl out by her silk pajama sleeve.
Move. Now.
Where? Julian wheezed, clutching his stapled stomach. The front is blocked. Rich people don't look at the help, Renna whispered, dragging them toward the far wall behind the refrigerator bank. And they definitely don't look at where their garbage goes. She knew the Obsidian Tower better than the people who paid millions to live in it. She knew which service elevators skipped floors and which vents connected to the boiler room. She jammed her fingers into a recessed groove in the wainscoting that looked decorative, but was actually a latch. A section of the wall popped open, revealing the utilitarian gray concrete of the service chase. Inside, she ordered. They tumbled into the narrow, cold corridor just as heavy boots hit the marble floor of the penthouse. The air here smelled of stale coffee and trash compactor fumes, the scent of the invisible workforce. Renna eased the panel shut, leaving only a hairline crack. Through it, she saw beams of tactical flashlights sweeping the darkness she had just occupied. Clear left. A deep voice boomed. Check the pantry. Julian slumped against the concrete wall, sliding down until he hit the floor. His sister clamped a hand over her own mouth to stifle a sob. Renna pressed her ear against the cold plaster, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Blood trail ends here, the voice said, closer now. Right on the other side of the wall. Renna held her breath. They were in the veins of the building now, a vertical maze of trash chutes and linen drops. The hitmen were hunting in a luxury apartment, but Renna had dragged the game into the walls. She looked at Julian, pale and sweating in the dark, and realized the power dynamic had shifted. Out there, he was the king. But in here, in the dark, narrow tunnels of the service world, she was the guide. And the cat and mouse game had just begun. The service elevator shuddered to a halt in the sub-basement. The air here was thick with diesel fumes and the sour rot of dumpster juice. Renna shouldered the heavy steel door open, dragging Julian's dead weight with her, his sister clinging silently to her jacket like a shadow. They stumbled out onto the concrete loading dock. It was a cavern of shadows and parked delivery trucks, silent except for the hum of industrial fans. Renna scanned the area for her van, but her eyes snagged on the glow of the glass-walled security booth. The guard was missing, likely doing rounds, but the small television inside was blaring. Renna froze. On the screen, beneath a bold red banner reading, "Breaking News, Attempted Assassination," was a photo. It wasn't Julian. It was a grainy, zoomed-in shot of a woman in a red delivery jacket entering the lobby. Suspect identified as Renna Stapes, the crawler read. Armed and dangerous. The breath left Renna's lungs in a rush. They hadn't just tried to kill Julian. They had already written the script for the aftermath. The delivery girl didn't just find the body. She was the patsy. Her anonymity was gone. They moved fast. Julian rasped, leaning heavily against a stack of wooden pallets, his hand pressing a bloody towel to his stapled stomach. Renna stared at her own face, distorted by the pixels. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was a target. "I can't go home," she whispered. "They know who you are because they need a narrative," Julian said, his voice gaining a terrifying edge despite his weakness. He pulled his collar down, exposing the sweat-slick skin of his neck. "And they need me alive. Do you know why?" He reached into his pocket, trembling, and pulled out a small UV keychain light, the kind bouncers used to check IDs. He clicked it on and held it to his neck. Renna gasped. Under the ultraviolet beam, the solid black ink of the serpent vanished. In its place, glowing, complex geometric patterns and strings of numbers erupted across the skin, woven invisibly into the design. "It's not just a tattoo," Julian whispered, the blue light casting hollow shadows on his face. It's UV reactive ink. Account numbers. Ledger access. Blackmail material on every judge and senator in the state. He clicked the light off, and the glowing data disappeared, leaving only the dark serpent. I'm not just the boss, Renna, he said, meeting her terrified gaze. I am the walking bank vault. If they catch me, they peel the skin off to get the codes. If they catch you, you're just the loose end that ties it all up. The engine of the battered delivery van coughed and sputtered, a jarring noise against the relentless drumming of the rain. Renna drove with white-knuckled precision, sticking to the side streets where the streetlights were broken, navigating the city's blind spots until they reached the veterinary clinic. She had a key, one of the perks of being the janitor, receptionist, and unauthorized night nurse all rolled into one. Inside, the air was cool and smelled sharply of bleach and wet fur. She stashed Julian's sister in the break room with a vending machine hot chocolate, then helped Julian onto a cold metal exam table. He hissed as he moved, his expensive suit now ruined beyond recognition, a stark clash against the sterile, utilitarian room. It's not the Ritz, Renna muttered, grabbing a fresh saline bag from the supply cabinet. It's cleaner than some safe houses I've been in, Julian replied, watching her hang the four with practiced ease. His gaze was intense, stripping away the layers of her defense. You move like a soldier, Renna. Efficient. No wasted energy. I move like someone who works 3 jobs and can't afford to make mistakes, she corrected him, taping a line to his arm. He reached out, his thumb brushing a jagged, faded white line on her forearm. Knife. Broken window, she said, looking down at the mark. We got evicted when I was 12. I tried to climb back in to get my teddy bear. I cut it to the bone. She didn't pull away. Not exactly a war story like yours. Survival is a war, Julian said softly. He gestured to the fresh staples in his own chest. My father gave me my first scar when I was 10, to teach me that pain is just information. And what is this pain telling you? Renna asked, her voice dropping, the space between them suddenly charged with a different kind of electricity. That I underestimated the delivery girl, Julian whispered. His eyes traveled from her scarred arm to her face, seeing her properly for the first time, not as a bystander, but as an equal. There was no fear in his look anymore, only a dangerous, magnetic respect. You didn't just stitch me up, Renna. You took command. Most of my captains would have folded by now. Renna felt a flush rise up her neck, hot and confusing. In the penthouse, she had been invisible. But here, under the hum of the fluorescent lights, she was the one holding the needle, and he was the one looking at her like she was the only solid thing in a collapsing world. Rest, she said, stepping back, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. We're not safe yet. I feel safe, he murmured, his eyes closing. For the first time all night. Julian hung up the burner phone, his hand trembling not from fear, but from the blood loss that had drained him to a pale husk. Marco is 5 minutes out, he rasped, leaning heavily against the exam table. He's bringing the car around back. Renna nodded, though her stomach twisted. She wiped a smudge of antiseptic from the counter, her eyes darting to the grainy black and white feed of the security monitor. 2 black SUVs screeched to a halt at the front curb, ignoring the alley entrance entirely. 4 men stepped out, weapons drawn, their silhouettes sharp and predatory against the street lamps. Julian, she whispered, her voice tight. That's not a pickup. That's a hit squad. Julian squinted at the screen, a low curse hissing through his teeth. He tried to push himself upright, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the steel table. Judas, he spat. He reached for the pistol Renna had placed on the tray, but his legs buckled immediately. He collapsed to one knee, a fresh bloom of crimson soaking the bandage at his side. He was a lion with no teeth, fierce in spirit, but broken in body. He wasn't fighting anyone tonight. The front glass shattered. Heavy boots crunched over the shards in the waiting room. Renna looked at Julian, helpless on the floor, then at the row of heavy-duty kennels lining the south wall. The isolation ward. These weren't the pampered poodles of the uptown elite. These were the strays the county couldn't handle, a scarred Rottweiler seized from a fighting ring and a Mastiff mix with a trigger-hair temper. They were pacing, low growls vibrating in their chests as they smelled the intruders. "Can you move?" she asked, grabbing Julian's good arm. "Leave me," he groaned, clutching his side. "Get out." "Not an option." She hauled him up, draping his heavy arm over her shoulder and dragging him toward the rear exit. As they passed the kennels, she paused. The dogs were already throwing themselves against the wire, reacting to the scent of strange men and the aggression in the air. Renna didn't hesitate. She kicked the latches upward, swinging the metal doors wide. "Go," she commanded, slapping the side of the crate. The effect was instantaneous. A blur of black and brindle muscle exploded into the hallway just as the gunman kicked open the exam room door. Panic replaced the tactical silence of the hit squad. Shouts erupted, followed by the deafening boom of shotgun fire and the wet tearing of clothes. Renna didn't look back. She shoved the heavy rear door open, the cool night air hitting her face like a slap. Dragging Julian into the wet alley, she listened to the chaos erupting inside, the screams of men who realized too late they weren't the only predators in the room. They disappeared into the shadows, leaving the sounds of the slaughter behind them. The silver serving tray trembled in Renna's hands, the crystal decanter rattling a treacherous beat against the glass. It wasn't the weight of the liquor causing the shake. It was the cold bore of a suppressed pistol pressed against her temple. The plan had disintegrated the moment she crossed the threshold. The butcher wasn't drinking tonight. He was waiting. "Did you really think a pretty face and a vintage scotch would get you close enough to poison me?" The butcher sneered, his heavy hand gripping the nape of her neck. He smelled of stale cigars and cheap cologne. "I run the city now. Julian is dog food." The double doors at the far end of the suite swung open. The air in the room shifted, growing instantly colder. Julian stood there. He wore a charcoal suit cut sharp enough to bleed on, his hair slicked back, his posture immovable. To the men in the room, he looked like a god of war returning to his throne. But Renna saw the truth. She saw the glassy sheen of fever in his eyes, and the way his left hand stayed deep in his pocket, likely holding his incision closed. He was a hollow statue, one stiff breeze away from shattering. "You're sitting in my chair, Enzo," Julian said, his voice a low rumble that betrayed no pain. The butcher, Enzo, blanched, the pistol wavering slightly as he turned his attention to the man he thought he'd buried. You were gutted." "I saw the blood." "You saw what I wanted you to see," Julian lied, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. Each footfall must have been agony, but he moved with a predator's grace. "And now I'm here to collect the rent." Enzo's eyes darted between Julian and his guards, uncertainty cracking his bravado. The resurrection had terrified him. "Kill him," he shrieked, his panic overriding his training. He swung the gun away from Renna's head to aim at Julian. It was the split second Renna needed. Her fingers curled under the rim of the heavy serving tray, finding the strip of duct tape she had placed there hours ago. With a savage rip, she freed the ceramic paring knife, undetectable by the metal detectors at the door. She didn't think, she just moved. As Enzo's finger tightened on the trigger, she drove the white blade down into the soft meat of his wrist. Enzo screamed, the gun firing harmlessly into the ceiling as it clattered to the floor. Renna kicked the weapon across the carpet. Julian was there in a heartbeat, ignoring the fire in his side to press the muzzle of his own hidden pistol against Enzo's forehead. The room froze. The guards, sensing the immediate shift in power, lowered their weapons. They knew a dead man when they saw one, and it wasn't Julian. Julian leaned down, sweat finally breaking through his composure, though only Renna was close enough to see it. "Get out," Julian whispered to the room, the command echoing like a thunderclap. "The king is back." The service elevator was a distant memory, a rusted relic of a life Renna had shed like a second skin. Today, she took the private lift, the kind that required a biometric scan, and moved with a silent, hydraulic hum. When the brass doors slid open, the scent of fresh paint and expensive leather greeted her. The penthouse bore no scars of the violence that had reclaimed it. The bloodstains on the carpet were gone, replaced by cream-colored wool that cost more than her old apartment building. Renna stepped inside, the click of her heels sharp against the marble entry. She wasn't wearing rain gear, and she wasn't clutching a soggy takeout bag to her chest. She wore a midnight blue suit, tailored to within an inch of its life, sharp enough to cut. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, elegant twist, revealing the diamond studs that caught the light of the chandelier. Julian was waiting on the balcony, staring out at the city grid that glittered like a circuit board below. He turned as she entered, and for a moment, the ghost of the bleeding man she'd found in the alley flickered over his features, the same intensity, the same dangerous gravity, but the weakness was gone. He was whole again, the king back on his square. "The Port Authority signed off," Renna said, tossing a thick folder onto the mahogany desk. Her voice was steady, commanding.
No contraband.
"Just logistics. Clean shipping lanes for the imports." Julian walked inside, picking up the file and thumbing through the pages. "Clean money spends slower," he murmured, a half-smile touching his lips. "But it lasts longer," she countered, walking to the wet bar to pour herself a sparkling water. "And you don't have to look over your shoulder while you spend it. The families are agreeing to the ceasefire because there's profit in peace. You're not just the boss anymore, Julian. You're the CEO." He closed the folder and looked at her. The admiration in his eyes wasn't just for her beauty, it was for her mind, the ruthless efficiency she had applied to his chaotic empire. In 3 months, she had transitioned from the woman who saved his life to the woman who saved his legacy. She wasn't a mascot. She was the architect of his new era. The consultant. He walked over to her, his movement fluid, the limp entirely gone. He took the glass from her hand and set it down, his fingers brushing hers. "You were right," he said softly. "About all of it." Renna turned to the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the rain streak against the reinforced glass. 3 months ago, she had been down there in the deluge, invisible and insignificant, trying to keep a pizza warm. She had stumbled upon a dying wolf and decided not to run. She caught her reflection in the glass, steely, composed, powerful. She hadn't just saved a life that night. She had ascended. She had found the bleeding man in the gutter, and in dragging him into the light, she had found her own crown.